4 vertical fabric panels hang against a gray background. From left to right, cream-colored, dark navy, olive green, and tan fabric with decorative trim at the top.
On behalf of the National Park Service, I would like to welcome you to the Corps of Discovery 2. This traveling exhibit is making its way across the United States, following the route taken by Lewis Clark 200 years ago. Our next program here in Attention Any Voices is going to be the program telling you a little bit about the story of Sacagawea. And our presenter for that is going to be Amy Mossett. She is a national consultant regarding Sacagawea. I'm going to turn the story over and stage over to her now.
Thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank the National Park Service and all of the staff from the National Park Service for traveling along this journey with us and for being such an important part of this whole bicentennial commemoration and having a venue that we can come to in all communities, no matter what side, to present the Lewis and Clark story. My name is, well actually I guess my name could be mentioned in a couple different ways. I am Mandan and Hidatsa. I am from the Northern Plains. I live in a Mandan and Hidatsa community today, but my Hidatsa ancestors met Lewis and Clark 200 years ago. And from our village, Lewis and Clark would obtain one of the greatest resources, one of the greatest assets that you could never place a value on. That was Sacagawea. She joined the Lewis and Clark expedition from the village on the south side of the Knife River in present-day North Dakota. And the Knife River that Sacagawea lived in, that Knife River village that she lived in was called Awadika. And it was on the south bank. It was the middle village. It was the center village of those 3 Hidatsa villages that Lewis and Clark would travel to occasionally when they came to visit our Hidatsa leaders. My Mandan relatives lived 7 miles down the river where the Knife River meets the Missouri River. And in the Mandan villages, there were 2 villages at the time when Meriwether Lewis and William Clark came to our part of the world. And remember, the Mandan, once powerful, once the wealthiest, most powerful nations on the Northern Plains, had been reduced to a mere 2,000 people, with 1,000 people inhabiting each of those villages on either side of the Missouri River. And Fort Mandan would be built in the vicinity of those villages, and would actually be named for my Mandan ancestors, Fort Mandan. My Mandan relatives called me still Ga'osahe, and my name in the traditional Hidatsa language, and it's through the Hidatsa clan that I actually received my traditional name. In Hidatsa, my name is Gakui Nagabagish. And
a person with long dark hair stands before a backdrop with Native American geometric patterns and a woven basket. They wear a white and brown patterned vest over a tan shirt, with feathers draped across their shoulder.
Our names come from, I think a lot of the traditional names are similar to the people in this part of the world because your names come from your way of life. Our names come from medicine bundles. They don't just give you names. It actually comes from medicine bundles, and only certain people can give names. And because we were an agricultural people, much like the people in this area that Lewis and Clark encountered, our names came from bundles that were associated with gardening, for example. And my name in Hidatsa and in Mandan is translated into English as a squash blossom, and it's the yellow flower that blooms on the squashes that we are growing still today. But I'm not here to talk about myself. I was here yesterday for some time and had a chance to visit with people, and I talked about this incredible young woman who lived with my ancestors at Awadika. I'm here to talk about Sacagawea. And there are so many things that can be said about this woman, but today I'm only going to talk about 4 things. I'm going to talk about her relationship with William Clark. There are many mysteries and a lot of speculation about Sacagawea's relationship with William Clark as compared to her relationship, for example, with Meriwether Lewis. So I want to talk about her relationship with William Clark. I'm going to talk about Sacagawea's relatives, her descendants. I'm going to talk about Sacagawea's name, Sacagawea, that name that we still know her by today. and then I'm going to talk just very, very briefly about Sacagawea's death. And all of these things that I'm talking about today have for so long been filled with so much controversy, and so many myths have risen from the story of Sacagawea. She's an incredible woman. She is the most celebrated woman in all of American history. And yet we know so little about her. Let's get right to the story about Sacagawea and William Clark. And the reason I want to talk about this is people often wonder, there's a lot of speculation about her relationship with William Clark. I even had somebody ask me if that little boy, Jean Baptiste, that little boy that William Clark so fondly referred to as my boy Pump, some people have actually asked if that little boy was the son of William Clark. Well, you need to know that not only was William Clark nowhere near that area when that little boy was born, he was also not anywhere near that area when that little boy was conceived. That little boy, Jean Baptiste Charbonneau, was born in the afternoon of February 11th in 1805. He was born at Fort Mandan. William Clark was not there, but then the father of the
A person wearing a beaded vest and fringed clothing stands before a backdrop displaying Native American woven blankets and text about government agencies and wildlife. They hold a woven basket and feathered object.
child was not there either. Toussaint Charbonneau, the husband of Sacagawea, had gone off hunting. William Clark was also out on this hunting party, but you know who was there? Meriwether Lewis. Meriwether Lewis actually assisted or presided over, in the absence of all of the midwives that would have been there to assist in the delivery of this child had Sacagawea been back at the village. William Clark, he was sort of the medical expert. He was the man who knew about medicine and remedies and treatments of the day. His mother, Lucy Marks, was an herbalist. His stepfather was a medical doctor. And before they came out here on this journey, Meriwether Lewis studied under the finest doctors to learn about medicine. And he would be the man mostly responsible for delivering or for treating people. William Clark would do that also later on, especially out to the west. But during Sacagawea's birth, William Clark presided over that birth along with another French-Canadian fur trader who had been living with my Mandan relatives. His name was Rene Gisson. You know, when this little boy was born, you really need to think back about his name. There's just this ongoing debate over what culture influenced Sacagawea more than the other. The Shoshone claimed that Sacagawea, remember now, Sacagawea was born Shoshone. She was Shoshone by birth. And at the age of about 10, 11 years old, my Hidatsa ancestors, on one of the hunting trips to the west, into the middle of what is now Montana, captured her and some other young Shoshone children, and only 2 of those young people were brought back. It was Sacagawea and another woman, another young child actually, not a woman, a young girl who was only a couple of years older than her. Well, Sacagawea lived in our village, and her culture changed somewhat. She had been born to the Shoshone and culturated in the Shoshone culture up until the time she was 10, 11 years old. And then she grew into womanhood in this Hidatsa village. And so the Hidatsa will tell you, well, it was more the Hidatsa culture that influenced her decisions because now she was a woman. But you know, when this little boy was born, he was not given a Shoshone name. This little boy, whose mother had grown into womanhood now in a Hidatsa village, was not given a Hidatsa name. This little boy was named after his French-Canadian grandfather, who was a fur trader from Montreal, Canada. This little boy was called Jean Baptiste Charbonneau. He was named after his grandfather, who was still living in Montreal. So this child was not the child of William Clark. But William
A person with long black hair wears a patterned jacket with geometric designs in tan and white. They stand beside decorative woven blankets with colorful stripes and geometric patterns. Text visible on the right reads on Servet. Army Corps. Apartment, Engagement and Willie.
Clark loved this little boy. He loved him so much that when this expedition ended on August 17th in 1806, after they had traveled all the way to the west coast and returned to our part of the country, William Clark had to say goodbye to this little boy. This little boy whom he had watched practically every day the first 19 months of his life. Any of you who have children know that in the first year of a child's life, so many things happen to that child. They grow from this little tiny bundle to a person. They develop a personality. They start learning to say words. They do all kinds of things. They learn how to walk. They learn how to talk. They laugh. They smile. William Clark watched that happen with this little boy the entire first year of his life and almost all the way into the second year. He was very fond of this little boy. And why William Clark and not Meriwether Lewis? Well, remember there were two pirogues that headed to the west, and the Charbonneau family traveled in that white pirogue. They traveled in that white pirogue with William Clark, and the Charbonneau family remained in close proximity, not just physical, but emotional, everything else, very close to William Clark. On many occasions, I would guess that William Clark would observe this little guy, Jean Baptiste. On many occasions, when a child is getting older and older and they're starting to toddle and they're very curious and they wander off away from their mother, or they start hanging too far over the side, perhaps in that boat he was riding in. And my guess is that it wasn't Sacagawea who constantly watched that little boy. There were many men in this expedition. And William Clark, I think, watched over that little boy just as closely as his own father, Jean Charbonneau. And if he was ever hanging too far over the side of that boat, and if William Clark was right there, my guess is that William Clark would have been the guy who reached out and grabbed that little boy. And I think one of the most difficult things for William Clark was to say goodbye to Jean Baptiste, to Saint Charbonneau, and Sacagawea. And on August 17th in 1806, he asked them if he could take that little boy back to St. Louis and educate him. He promised that he would raise Jean Baptiste like his own son. But this little boy was only 19 months old, and the Charbonneau family, I'm sure, were flattered that William Clark, this man who they held in very high esteem because of all that he had done for them, this man was offering to educate their son in a place that was much more comfortable and a lot less dangerous than the place they were living right then. But because he was only 19 months old, the Charbonneau family decided he would have to stay at our...
A person wearing a beaded, cream-colored vest with geometric patterns stands speaking in front of a backdrop with colorful woven textiles and partial text visible. Long dark hair frames their face as they gesture while speaking.
With his mother and father, and they promised when he was older they would bring him to St. Louis, and they did. In the fall of 1809, when the Corps of Discovery, but after Meriwether Lewis had hired 100 soldiers to open the Missouri River back up and return White Coyote, a Mandan leader who had traveled south in the fall or in the late summer of 1806. White Coyote was this part of this Indian delegation that they convinced to go back to meet the President of the United States. They had to return him. That was the promise. When White Coyote agreed that he would go south with the Corps of Discovery in August of 1806, he told them, "I will go with you only if you return me in 1 year." They tried to keep their word. They tried to return him in the fall of 1807, but the Arikara, our enemies, the enemies of the Mandan and the Hidatsa, the Sioux, the enemies of the Mandan and Hidatsa, would not let anyone back up through that river. And so White Coyote had to go back to St. Louis. And realizing how important that trade was on the Missouri River, Meriwether Lewis had these soldiers hired, and they returned White Coyote to his village. And then in that time, probably by October, November of 1809, when they returned to St. Louis, the Charbonneau family went with them. And we know they went with them because that little boy, Jean Baptiste Charbonneau, now 4.5 years old, was baptized in St. Louis at the old cathedral, right there by the Mississippi River. A visiting Jesuit priest was in town, and he baptized the son of Toussaint Charbonneau and Sacagawea. The godfather of this little boy was none other than Auguste Chouteau, the founder of St. Louis. And that baptismal record, which you can still see today, is written entirely in French. And not long after that, this little boy would then begin his education under the guidance of William Clark. And by the time he was a young man, he would be speaking 6 or 7 different languages. And because now William Clark was the superintendent or the commissioner for Indian Territory, and he was engaged in business dealing with all of the matters of the Indians, and people had to go to his office to get permission to go up and engage in trade with the Indians. And they would often need a guide and a scout and an interpreter. And who other would they get referred than Jean Baptiste Charbonneau? He served as a scout and a guide and an interpreter up and down the Missouri River out to the west. He befriended people of all nationalities, all cultures, many different walks of life. He even was befriended by a prince who came here from Germany, wanting to travel to the west to visit Indian cultures before they disappeared. His name was
A person with long black hair and dangling earrings speaks at a microphone while wearing a brown and white geometric patterned vest. Behind them is a colorful woven blanket or textile with geometric designs in orange, blue, and other colors.
Paul. He was the prince at Württemberg. And his relationship with Jean Baptiste grew. He took him back to Germany. And so for 6 years, the son of Sacagawea lived as a guest in the royal household at Bad Mergentheim. And then he returned to this country, and he continued to travel into the West. He went west during the Mexican Wars. He was a scout and a guide for General Stephen Kearny, the stepson-in-law of William Clark. Jean Baptiste Charbonneau traveled to the west during the gold rush. He traveled north into Oregon. And then he told friends in 1866, he was now 61 years old. He said he longed to go back out onto the plains to visit his relatives. And he started that journey, but he didn't make it out of Oregon. Because when he got to the Jordan Valley, he came down with pneumonia. He died, and he was buried at a place called the Inskip Station near present-day Danner, Oregon. And that was really part of the life, or a real brief history of the life of Jean Baptiste Charbonneau, this young man that William Clark called my boy Pomp. And speaking of Pomp, where did that name come from, Pomp? The Shoshone will tell you that that name means something about a lot of black hair. Well, you know, every Indian baby 200 years ago and today has a lot of black hair. And so the Hidatsa, on the other hand, say that Pomp was a Pompi, or Bumpe, is a Hidatsa word, and it means something about a stinky little boy. Well, I'm not going to say all little boys were stinky little boys. We don't call all the little boys Bumpe. But there's a lullaby. There's a lullaby that was sung that uses this word that's similar to that. But you know, again, I don't think that word or that name, Pomp, came from a Shoshone word, and I don't think it came from a Hidatsa word. I think it came from William Clark. This little boy was called Pompey. He called him Pompey. It was actually a rather common slave name, as was Toby, which was the name given to that Shoshone man who helped to guide them over the mountains. It's also as common as that other slave name, Jamie, that nickname that was given to Sacagawea by William Clark. But that, of course, takes us into this whole issue of slavery, because these people were not seen as slaves in the purest sense when you think about what slavery was, but they were just so common names that were just so commonly accepted.
A person wearing a beaded vest with geometric patterns over a tan dress stands at a podium. Colorful geometric blankets hang behind them. Text on a screen to the right reads partial words including relation, core, and wildlife.
At the time, 200 years ago, Pomp is not a Hidatsa word. Pomp is not a Shoshone word. But you know, William Clark named the landmark after this young boy. in July of 1806 when they were traveling back and Meriwether Lewis had taken the Missouri River and gone north. William Clark and the Charbonneau family were on the Yellowstone traveling back east, and they were now past present-day Billings, Montana. And they came to this huge sandstone outcropping, a place that the Crow people call a place where the mountain lion sleeps. And that huge sandstone outcropping is where William Clark carved his name deep into that sandstone. And you can still see it today. It's all covered, it's protected, and it's probably the only physical evidence that remains today from the Lewis and Clark expedition. And that sandstone landmark was named for Sacagawea's son. It was called Pompey's Tower. Today it is known as Pompey's Pillar, a National Historic Landmark. William Clark loved that little boy, Jean Baptiste Charbonneau. But did he love Sacagawea? And did she love him? I think she did. I think Sacagawea loved William Clark because if you look at the relationship between the two of them, I think she loved him the way any young woman would love an older brother or a relative who protected her. And if you think about all of the times and all of the events that occurred in this expedition or throughout this journey, you can see time and again how William Clark protected Sacagawea. When they were traveling to the west, and on May 14th of 1805, when that white pirogue that they were traveling capsized, when the wind caught the sail and it rocked it way to one side and the water was rushing over the side of that boat, there were some expert French boatmen in that river. And it's true that Toussaint Charbonneau was a Frenchman, but he was not a waterman. This man was afraid of water. He panicked. He had actually been in control of this boat at the time, and William Clark and Meriwether Lewis were out there on the shore walking along when they saw this whole incident, this episode taking place. And I'm sure they were thinking about the cargo that was in that boat, precious cargo, things that they did not want to lose. And all this commotion with all the yelling going on and people trying to bail out that boat with kettles and everything else they could find, Sacagawea was sitting in the back of that pirogue. And you know where it rocked? It just hung to the side, and the water was rushing in. Pierre Cruzat eventually pulled a gun and threatened Toussaint Charbonneau and told him if he didn't get control of himself.
A person with long black hair wears a white and brown geometric patterned jacket with fringe trim and beaded accessories. They stand gesturing while speaking, with Native American art and partial text visible on a backdrop behind them.
And that boat that he would shoot him, well, we know he would never have shot him, but he was threatening him. He was trying to bring this man back to his senses. And in all this commotion, there was Sacagawea, this young, teenaged Indian woman at the back of the boat. Her son was probably in his cradle board on her back. And there were items that had drifted overboard, some of the lighter things, and as they floated past, she grabbed them and she pulled them back into the boat. And both captains, even Meriwether Lewis, who usually didn't have many great things to say about Sacagawea, or he was mostly indifferent toward her, even he praised her for her courage and her fortitude. And only days after that, on May 20th in 1805, they named a river after her, or a tributary of the river after her out there in Montana. And I am convinced that this is the first time that Meriwether Lewis ever wrote her name. He wrote it exactly the way he heard it, Sacagawea. And he wrote the translation of that name right beside it, Bird Woman. And they call that river Bird Woman's River. And the journey continued on, and in June, Sacagawea became very, very sick. And William Clark cared for her. William Clark employed the most common treatment of the day because Meriwether Lewis was gone again. He was sort of the doctor. But the most common treatment of that day, of course, was to bleed somebody, to make an incision in the vein in their arm and just let the blood leave the body so that your body could create new, healthy blood. And this was by June 10th or 10th when he bled her. And she got worse. And he knew that he had to do something drastic to help her, so a day or so later, he bled her again. And she was now near death. And a few days later, it was William Clark who carried her, and he put her in the back of that white pirogue out of the sun to protect her because she was burned up with fever, she was dehydrated. And finally, it was William Meriwether Lewis, when they returned, who administered opium bark and those kinds of medical treatments, and she recovered. As they continued to travel to the west, on one of these days that same month at the end of June, this huge storm was brewing out there, and you could see it in the sky, and William Clark knew, and again, remember, the Charbonneau family was in the white pirogue, and William Clark needed to get that boat off the water, because just in looking at the clouds, you knew what kind of weather you were in for. And they got this boat off the water. They were going to seek shelter in a ravine, but by this time, the rain was already coming down out of the sky, and then all of a sudden, there came the hail. And along with the hail and the rain,
a person wearing a tan and white beaded vest and holding a woven basket stands on a stage with geometric patterned blankets displayed behind them. Text panels listing government departments are visible on the right side of the frame.
the water was causing a mudslide, and rocks were coming down off of the hills, and before you knew it, the water was swirling up around their feet. And Toussaint Charbonneau, this man who we know was a very timid waterman, was the first guy up the ravine. And I'm sure that as he was climbing up the hill, he probably thought, maybe he came back to his senses a little bit and thought, oh, my wife, and turns back around and reaches for Sacagawea, who was clinging to her little boy. But it was William Clark who was behind her, and he was pushing her up this ravine, getting her out of harm's way. And that day, William Clark lost one of his measuring devices, but it was a rather large compass-like thing. And after that storm subsided, they were able to go back and recover it. But Sacagawea that day lost Jean Baptiste's cradleboard. They did not recover that. It washed away. Did they replace it? No, of course not. Because he was growing. He no longer needed a cradleboard. And the journey continued to the west. They were now in Shoshone country at the end of August. And imagine this, I have a hard time imagining her husband. We've heard many things about Toussaint Charbonneau. We've heard what a scoundrel and what a rascal he was. But he struck his wife. There they were, right in her own homeland, among her people, and that night, at supper time, he struck his wife. We don't know why. But it was William Clark who severely admonished this man for treating his wife that way. And Toussaint Charbonneau knew from that point on, after being rebuked by William Clark for what he did, that for the remainder of that journey, he was expected to treat his wife with respect and dignity. And I expect that that's what he did from that point on, especially when they were in the presence of William Clark. And the journey continued to the west, and when they were out on the Pacific Ocean, imagine this. It was, I think, in January. Well, first, let's go back to November, as not long after they had arrived out on the west coast. Sacagawea was caring for her child. That was probably the most important role, the most important thing that was on her mind from day to day. But they had been on the north side of the Columbia River. They had been checking out the place, traveling up and down the river, trying to determine where they would build their winter quarters. It was November of 1805, and by the end of November, they needed to make a decision on which side of that Columbia River they should winter on. The Chinook were on the north side of the Columbia River, and the Chinook invited them to winter with them, to engage in trade with them. The Chinook were very savvy traders. They had been trading with all kinds of non-Indian people that were coming into their territory by boat. They wanted to.
A person with long black hair and earrings sits on a couch wearing a tan and white beaded vest. Behind them is a banner with geometric patterns and partial text visible on a gray background.
Trade with Lewis and Clark. But the land on the other side of the river, on the south side of the river, was a little richer in elk meat. And they knew by this time that they needed this elk. They needed the elk for meat, but they also needed those elk hides for clothing, because by this time, their military uniforms would become very tattered and worn. They would have to make many pairs of moccasins for that journey home. And they needed to make this decision, and so they decided to have sort of a vote, and there's a big debate on whether this was really a vote or whether it was just an opinion poll, but they recorded the opinions of all of the people in that expedition. Everyone was able to provide some input on this decision, everyone including York, William Clark's black servant. Every adult member in this expedition, including Sacagawea, this young Indian woman who was probably not yet 18 years old, they all sort of voted to stay on the south side of the Columbia River. A couple months later, Sacagawea was hearing the stories about a huge, gigantic creature that had come out of the great waters. And the men had ventured on down the coast, and they came back and they were talking about this huge thing, which to her sounded kind of like a fish creature. And she knew, living out there in western Montana, what a salmon looked like. She knew how big a salmon could get. And over there at the Knife River, I mean, it's not a very big river, but we had fish in there. There were catfish. They don't get too big in that river. There were little catfish that everyone called bullheads or something like that, but they were real small. And she had seen these fish, but this fish that they were talking about was gigantic. And she was determined that she wanted to go and see that animal or that creature. And I'm sure that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were quite amused that she was so insistent. And this was probably the one time that she really asserted herself and told them that I have come this far, and if you don't let me go out there to see that animal, that fish creature, it would be very hard for me to have to go all the way back home without seeing it. Well, she did go see that animal. And I often think about the stories that she told my ancestors when she got back to the villages. Imagine her telling the women sitting around inside the earth lodge that she had seen the sea creature. First of all, even trying to explain to them what the ocean looked like, because we had no ocean out here on the plains. And trying to explain to them that if you looked out into the horizon for as long as you could see.
A person wearing a beaded white and brown vest over a yellow skirt stands with one arm extended, gesturing while speaking. Native American woven blankets hang behind them, and text listing federal agencies appears on the right side of the frame.
It was water. Nothing else. It was all water. It was the ocean. That would be hard to imagine, I think. But then to tell them that this creature had come out of the ocean, and it was something like a fish, but it was so big, it was bigger than a buffalo. And I'm sure that the women sitting around inside that earth lodge around the fire were probably rolling their eyes. But then she probably told them that this creature was so big that it could not fit inside this earth lodge. Well, needless to say, I'm sure that Sacagawea had some real serious credibility problems after that. You talk about fish stories, we had them back then too. But Sacagawea was out in the west at Christmas time. And at Christmas time, they were exchanging gifts. The men were sort of celebrating Christmas or commemorating that day, and we don't have Christmas. But Sacagawea presented William Clark with a gift. She gave him about 24 weasel tails, which is really rather interesting because we don't have Christmas. We don't know if she gave anything to anyone else. I don't think she gave anything to Meriwether Lewis. I rather doubt if she gave anything to Jean Baptiste Charbonneau. But she cared very much for William Clark, and she gave him this gift. And on another occasion, she gave him this little morsel of bread that she had been saving for her son for a very long time. It was a bread that was made with flour, I think. And I think William Clark noted in his journals that she must have been carrying it with her for quite some time because it was kind of not that tasty, but just the idea that this was the first morsel of bread that he had eaten for a very long time. And Sacagawea gave that to him. And then there's this story about the blue beaded belt. It wasn't William Clark who wanted that belt. It was Meriwether Lewis. You didn't actually ask for the belt, but Sacagawea had a blue beaded belt. And of all the beads that William Clark and Meriwether Lewis brought up the river, they did not bring enough blue beads. And you hear the story about how the women in all of these tribes loved blue beads. Why? They had other colored beads. They had white beads, they had red beads, they had all these different colored beads. So what was the big thing about blue beads? Why were they so valuable? We know blue. Blue it's a primary color. It's one of the first colors that you see. It is the color most easily distinguishable to the human eye, because on the light spectrum it's
A person wearing a geometric pattern jacket and beaded vest stands on a stage beside a colorful woven banner and wooden carved figure. Text visible on the backdrop reads Servation. Itikor. Partment. Agement, and then wild.
It has the shortest wavelengths, and so you see blue first. But out there in nature, when you walk outside and you look at the sky, and in the summer the sky is just the most beautiful blue. Different shades of blue. But out there in the environment, blue is one of those colors that you can't touch. And for many of us, we could not replicate that color. And when we colored porcupine quills to decorate our husbands' buffalo robes, and when we decorated porcupine quills to decorate our moccasins or our teepees or however we use that, we could not make blue. We could make yellow from cottonwood and goldenrod and sunflower, and we could make brown from the rushes. We could make red from all of these different plants. Dogwood, plum, purple. We had the most brilliant shades of purple from chokecherries and all. We had pink, but we did not have blue. And when they brought these beads and they were blue, they were a treasure. And Sacagawea took off that blue belt and she gave it to her husband, who gave that belt to Meriwether Lewis, because there was a coat out there, a sealskin or a sea otter jacket or a shirt that Meriwether Lewis wanted. And the only way that Indian man out there would trade it is if Meriwether Lewis offered more. And the only way that trade was finally negotiated was with Sacagawea's blue belt. Well, they did give her something in exchange. They gave her a wool coat. It was blue. Sacagawea loved William Clark, and he had a special place in her heart because this man protected her and he protected her son. And you know how we are whenever there's somebody of prominence who watches out for our children and provides them with an opportunity that we could never give them. Our children are always more important than we are. William Clark found that place in Sacagawea's heart for all the things that he did for her. He protected her more than any man in her entire life. There was no man in that Shoshone village that saved her when she was captured at the age of 12. There was no man in the Hidatsa village who could save her or who would protect her if there was somebody who mistreated her, perhaps. No one protected her the way William Clark did. And because of that, she loved him. Sacagawea's name appears in the Lewis and Clark journals about 26 times. It's never written with a J.
A person with long dark hair wears a brown and white geometric pattern jacket and speaks at a microphone. Behind them are Native American art panels with colorful geometric designs and partial text visible on the right side.
Sacagawea's name was spelled 16 different ways in the Lewis and Clark journals, not once with a J. And in 1814, when Nicholas Biddle edited the Lewis and Clark journals, he put the J in Sacagawea's name. That J in her name did not come from the Shoshone. It did not come from the Hidatsa. It came from Nicholas Biddle. And it is true that on one occasion, when William Clark recorded in his 1825 account book that Sacagawea was dead, he wrote her name with a G that looked like a J. It doesn't have a dot on the top of it. He also wrote letters to George Rogers Clark, his brother, and he spelled George on more than one occasion with a J, or a G that looked like a J. And it doesn't really matter because George is George. It's a soft G. It could be spelled with a J, but he also wrote wagon on one occasion with a W-A-G-O-N, and that G looked like a J. We are not going to change the way we pronounce wagon just because of that. The J in Sacagawea's name was an error, but it's an error that has caused people to mispronounce her name for the last over 200 years. Sagaga is a Hidatsa word for bird. Wea is almost a universal Siouan word for woman. Sacagawea is a Hidatsa word for bird woman. Sacagawea had a name, a Shoshone name, before we captured her in 1800. And by now, even Shoshone descendants will tell you that they no longer know what that name was. But perhaps it doesn't matter, because if Sacagawea had gone back to that village and stayed there, she would have been given a new name, a new Shoshone name. It would not have been Sacagawea. It would not have been Bird Woman. Sacagawea died on December 20th in 1812, and she was buried near Fort Manuel on the Missouri River, on the west side of the Missouri River near the borders of North and South Dakota. Fort Manuel was a fur trading post that was established by the Manuel-Lisa fur trade expedition. Meriwether Toussaint Charbonneau had traveled back to the north. He had been engaged in trade with his friend Rene Gisson. Sacagawea had been at the fort since about 1811. The fur trade expedition had come up the river in 1811, and she was recorded in Henry Brackenridge's journal as being sickly or frail or ill. And I don't think that she was really sickly. She may have been frail. She may not have been feeling her best, but I think her medical condition was characteristic of any woman who was expecting.
A person wearing a beaded and fringed white and brown vest stands before a backdrop with Native American geometric patterns and a wooden boat model. Text on the right reads on serve. Army Seat Department. Nagim and INW.
Child. And when she died, John Luddig, the agent at that fort who recorded this entry in his journal that evening in December, also made other comments about her. He talked about what a good woman she was, and he also said she left a very fine infant girl. Sacagawea has people, or she has descendants all over this country. There are people among the Lenhi Shoshone tribe in Idaho who will tell you that they are the descendants of Sacagawea, and they are. They are her only true genealogical, biological blood descendants, but they are not direct descendants. They are the descendants of her brother, Camuate. There are people among the Hidatsa tribe of North Dakota who will tell you that they are the descendants of Sacagawea, and they are, but they are not her biological descendants. They are her adopted descendants. And there is a man, if you look on this website that the three affiliated tribe maintains right now, there was a man called Bullseye, a Hidatsa man, who said Sacagawea was his grandmother. And she was. Bullseye is 100% Hidatsa. Sacagawea is 100% Shoshone. So how could this woman be Bullseye's grandmother? Every one of the women that Toussaint Charbonneau married, including the Hidatsa woman that he was married to before Sacagawea, Sacagawea and Otter woman, these two Shoshone women, the Assiniboine woman that Toussaint Charbonneau married at Fort Clark in the 1820s, every one of those women, every wife of Toussaint Charbonneau would be the grandmother of Bullseye. All of those women shared in common the title of mother to all of Toussaint Charbonneau's children. And that's the way things are in our family. It's the way it still is today. But today people are misinterpreting and confusing all of these issues, and they're misinterpreting our own history. Sacagawea did not die on the Wind River Reservation in 1884 in April. She was not buried on the Wind River Reservation. There was a Shoshone woman who was buried there by a Reverend Fox. The only name in the record on the day that woman was buried was that this woman, she's not even mentioned by name. She was called Basil's mother. Sacagawea did not have a son named Basil, and Sacagawea never traveled to the Wind River Reservation. She had long since been dead before this woman had ever lived.
A person stands on a stage wearing a tan dress, beaded vest, and a feathered headdress. Behind them is a colorful woven blanket with geometric patterns. Text banners referencing government departments and conservation programs are visible in the background.
The last thing I was going to talk about was, we talked about William Clark, we talked about Sacagawea's name just a little bit, we talked about Sacagawea's family, and a little about her death. The one thing I wanted to say about Sacagawea is that when we continue this bicentennial commemoration and we continue to commemorate all of the individuals of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and when you travel from tribe to tribe to tribe, you continue to hear oral tradition, stories that have been handed down from generation to generation to generation. The one thing that you need to remember about all of the stories that we receive from our elders, these are stories that we don't question. And when your grandparents or your great-grandmother is telling you a story, telling a story to a young person, that young person does not sit there and say, well, what about this? And how come it's that way? And that's not the way I heard it, or so-and-so said something different. When your grandparent is telling you a story, you listen, because that elder is giving you a gift, and you don't question. You don't contradict what they're saying. In the case with Sacagawea, all of these stories that you hear today are stories that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation and have mostly gone unquestioned. Which is why there are people among the Comanche tribe of Oklahoma who will tell you that they are the descendants of Sacagawea, that she did travel to their part of the world, that she did meet a Comanche man, and that she did have Comanche children, and that they did give her the name Lost Woman. And they truly believe that. And when you talk to the people among the Lemhi Shoshone tribe, their stories about Sacagawea are filled with passion and conviction, because that is what they have been taught to believe. And when you listen to Bullseye's descendants, they honestly believe that they are the descendants of Sacagawea, whether they are biologically or not. There are oral traditions of Sacagawea not only among those three tribes, but among the Lakota, the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Nez Perce. My ancestors at Awadika have many stories and oral traditions of Sacagawea. And the one thing I want to say about Sacagawea is that we all gathered together in National Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. last October. And along with the state of North Dakota, we dedicated our state's second statue in National Statuary Hall. It was a statue of Sacagawea. The woman who posed for that statue was a Hidatsa woman. Her name was Mink. Her descendants all live on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota.
A person stands on stage wearing a beaded white shirt, fringed tan skirt, and feathered shoulder piece. Behind them is a colorful geometric patterned blanket and a woven basket. Text overlays list government agencies and organizations.
And some people question why. If you know this was a Shoshone woman, why did you have a Hidatsa woman's image going to the nation's capital to represent this woman? Well, there are several reasons. We have no idea what Sacagawea looked like. And if Meriwether Lewis, this man who could describe an event or the river or an animal so vividly that you could close your eyes and actually see that creature, he would describe birds, the sound of a bird so vividly that you could almost hear the sound of that bird, but he never told us what Sacagawea looked like. He could tell you the wingspan on that condor, and the length of the feathers, the size and the color of its beak, its height from the ground. We don't know how tall Sacagawea was, because nobody described her. There has never been a painting, a photo, or a description of this incredible young woman. But we sent this image of of a Hidatsa woman to Washington, D.C. because we decided what better image than that of a Hidatsa woman. Because had it not been for Sacagawea's life in this Hidatsa village, she would never have met this French-Canadian fur trader Toussaint Charbonneau. She would never have had this little boy, Jean Baptiste Charbonneau. She would never have met Meriwether Lewis or William Clark. Had it not been for her life in this Hidatsa community in what is now North Dakota, she never would have been part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But most importantly, think of that name, Sacagawea. We gave that name to her. And the one thing that we are proud of in North Dakota, all of us descendants of Awadikha, that Hidatsa village, had it not been for her life with us, there is not a soul in the entire universe who would have ever heard of this woman that we call Sacagawea. Thank you so very much. We are going to just answer a couple of questions here, but before I take any questions, I just want to again thank my friends Bud Clark, descendant of William Clark. Bud and I have had just an incredible journey sharing this story. And one of the stories, when we have been to the nation's capital on a number of occasions just because of this whole Lewis and Clark thing. And in 2001, in January, when William Clark was finally given his commission, or he was finally acknowledged as
a person wearing a fringed tan dress and beaded vest stands beside a decorative blanket with geometric patterns in blue, white, and rainbow colors displayed on a stand. Behind them is a wall with text listing various federal agencies and institutions.
A captain. Bud Clark and his brother John accepted that citation, or they accepted that certificate from President Bill Clinton. And at the same time, York and Sacagawea were both given honorary commissions or honorary recognition as sergeants. They were honorary sergeants in the Army. And I sat right beside Bud Clark. I was invited to accept the citation along with Roseanne Abrahamson from the Shoshone tribe. But I got to sit right beside Bud Clark in the front row in the East Room at the White House. And it's memories like that. You will never forget those times. And Bud was laughing at me because I was just dragging him from room to room, and we were taking pictures in the red room and the blue room and the East Room, and all of the guards in the White House thought it was kind of nuts. And but we had, it was a memorable time. And Scott Mandrell is just an incredible person. I was telling somebody earlier today that he has been with this thing. He rode his horse to, where was it, Harper's Ferry? From D.C. to Pittsburgh, and I was telling somebody about that this morning. But we are looking forward to your arrival on the Northern Plains in North Dakota. We will make sure there's a lot of wood for the fires, and we will see you there. And I want to thank you for what you did here today with the Omaha tribe. I've been working with tribes all along the Lewis and Clark Trail, and what took place here this morning, a presentation to the chairman here for the Omaha Nation and all of the people in this community, was incredible. And I just want to say, I think that all of you, Scott and Bud and the whole Corps of Discovery, Rediscovery, or the what do you call your organization again? The Rediscovery Corps? Discovery Expedition of St. Charles, Missouri. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
We do have time for just a couple of questions, so if you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We have a microphone to pass around so everyone can hear the question, so go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. All right, Mr. Clark.
A person in a tan hat and olive green jacket holds a microphone while speaking. Behind them is a sign listing federal departments and agencies, with a colorful geometric pattern textile displayed to the right.
Amy, I just wondered if you've ever had personal contact with descendants of Jean Baptiste.
I've had many, everywhere I go, I get phone calls and emails from people who tell me that they are descendants, well, not of Jean Baptiste, but of Toussaint Charbonneau. With Jean Baptiste, the only instance that I have ever encountered anyone with any information about that was when I was in Germany. And a woman came up to me and she had done her master's thesis on Jean Baptiste Charbonneau. And in the thesis, she mentions a woman over there in Germany, or in that part of the country, that had a child with Jean Baptiste Charbonneau. He lived there for 6 years. And the child, according to the story, died in infancy. I don't know of any other descendants of Jean Baptiste. We have new information being uncovered every day. Recently, Sacagawea, of course, had 2 other children, Mossett, and perhaps another child. And there have been baptismal and death records, and there have been 2 death records found just recently for 2 girls. We don't know if either of those, well, the oldest of the girls died at 21, Mossett. We don't know if she had any children, because on her death certificate, her name is written as Mossett Charbonneau, meaning she would have been married. Have you heard of any descendants from Jean Baptiste? I'm sure by 2006 they will be coming out of the woodwork. I have, no matter where I go, I meet somebody who tells me they are a descendant of Toussaint Charbonneau, and I believe it.
Do you think that the incredible interest in Lewis and Clark will be sustained for 2 years and beyond? I'm thinking of the journey back down. Of course, back to St. Louis, everybody was going pretty fast. But what do you see 2 years from now and beyond?
I think that what's happened is that when this ends in 2006, in September of 2006, I really don't think it's going to end. I think that right now we are all so involved in building legacies and creating partnerships. And I think that all of these legacies and all of the partnerships will get stronger all the time, and they will be lasting. And that's what this whole, I think that's the most important part of the whole bicentennial commemoration, is that this is not just one big party that's going to end in 2006. This is a time for us, it's an opportunity for us to build lasting relationships between communities, between Native Americans and non-Indian entities, between all the governmental entities.
A person wearing a tan-fringed garment and beaded vest stands before a woven blanket with geometric patterns in blue, white, orange, and green. Text visible in the background lists various government departments and agencies.
I mean, there are major partnerships that are being established right now that have never existed in the past. They're not going to end in September of 2006. They're going to be continued. And the interest in Lewis and Clark and American history, this is just going to spark more interest, I think, in American history. I mean, we are already talking to people who want to continue this, because in 2007, they have to have a ball at the White House because Sacagawea, White Coyote, the tribal leader, was there, and they're already talking to us about, and I'm not going to say dragging this thing on, but I mean continuing it. And he was out at Monticello, and then of course David Thompson, the fur trader, was up in this part of the country, and they're already working on plans to commemorate that. And at the last Trail Heritage Foundation meeting I was at, they are looking at commemorating the next 100 years. So no, we're not going to stop at anything here.
Well, on behalf of the National Park Service and our Traveling Corps of Discovery 2 exhibit, I would like to thank Amy Mossett for coming and sharing her story of Sacagawea with us today, and joining me in thanking her.
Thank you so much.
Our next program here in the 10-minute